Follow me, your conscience. I want to bury it inside here.
Yes. Motivo Dicta a parlé. Sankara a parlé. Goïta est en train de parler.
All the people that you see here are students. But the most important thing is that they don't know what to expect in the future. But the French kids who are going to school just like you, they know already when they finish the school, they have a job, they have a house, they have
Abba!
America!
Abba!
France!
Abba!
England!
Abba!
Arab!
Abba!
Everyone!
Abba!
Africa, we stand together!
Mass young fool! Commando! Mass young fool! Commando!
Peace and love, freedom and decolonization to all African people, those at home, those abroad, and those in the future. If you have 2 shoes, please sell one and buy a sword. If you have 2 trousers, please sell one and buy a sword, because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is no longer on streets. This revolution is in the mind. It's about building our own things and selling them to make money. Essentially, this revolution is in the mind. Receive our revolutionary greetings from the African Continental Unity Party. My name is Kabbalah from the ACUP, and I'm here again to engage you on another very interesting topic, or I should say interesting development on the African continent. And it is concerning French imperialism in West Africa. As we have seen it on the news, the last French military base in West Africa, precisely in Senegal, has been closed down, which is the last French military presence in West Africa. I think from that we only have the remaining military presence in Djibouti. But as far as the West Africa is concerned, Senegal was the last place where French has or had its military presence or military base, which is now closed down. Well, I don't know what is your analysis. How do you perceive this development? And what can we as African people learn as a lesson from it? As far as I'm concerned, from a revolutionary understanding where I'm coming from, I have 2 important lessons that I think we should learn from this development, or 2 important questions that we need to ask. I think the fundamental question that we have to ask about this whole topic is that, is Senegal now more secure than it was before the French departure? Is Senegal more sovereign and more independent than it was prior to the closure or the closing down of the military base? And these are the important questions that I think we need to ask as African people, so that we don't do the same mistakes that we have done in the past. Now, the first thing that I have to observe from this development is about, in my observation that I want to talk about, is what I've called burden shifting. Burden shifting, it's what happened actually at the independence period in Africa. As we know that in around the 1960s, African countries began to gain their independence from former colonial oppressors. And when you look at it critically, strategically, and historically, one thing becomes clear, and that is independence was actually the burden, or actually the cost shifting. In other words, former colonial powers had to accept independence as a way of shifting the cost or the burden of running colonies onto Africans themselves. As you know, prior to independence, colonialist powers ran colonies by themselves. They had to fund educational system, military or defense system. They had to fund health system. They had to fund all type of infrastructures that permitted them to eventually exploit the continent's resources, right? So these basic infrastructures and systems that they have put in place, which allowed the colonies to function, were actually the burden which they had to take charge of. They had to pay soldiers. They had to pay healthcare workers. They had to pay teachers. They had to pay all pretty much everything in the country, just like what we're doing right now. So the cost of running colony in dealing with all these details that I've just explained was kind of astronomical, so that they had to accept easily to grant independence to African nations, which strategically from their point of view was actually to pass on the cost of running colony to Africans themselves, so that they can only deal with the profits of extraction from African soil or African resources. And this is true because these are the people who captured Africa by war or through force, and there was no way that they were willing to let Africa be free just because Africans stood on the streets and demanded that independence must be granted. This was an impossibility. These people who have captured you by force, the only way for you to get rid of them is by utilizing the equivalence of the same forces which they used to put you down. I think this has to be properly understood by African people. So independence pretty much was just a cost shifting. They had to shift the cost of running colonies on black people themselves, so that black people can run the colonies on themselves and pay the dividends to the former colonial powers. And that is what we call today independence. And the proof is simple. The evidence is everywhere. For example, French was receiving about 400 billion of US dollars out of the 14 countries in Africa which it was colonizing, and this is actually the dividends that I was talking about. So we have to think critically about this closing of the French military base in Africa, so that it shouldn't be the same thing that happened at independence period. It shouldn't be a kind of military neocolonialism as we are living now in what we can call a political and economic neocolonialism, right? Because they left physically, but we are incurring the cost and they're still getting dividends out of Africa. So we don't want a situation whereby French troops physically leave the continent, but France continues to benefit from the weakness of the continent, or of Senegal in particular. That's why we need to look at it closely from this perspective, so that the mistake of the past cannot be repeated today. And this should be really the independence, military independence and sovereignty reclamation of Senegal, and of course of the whole continent. And the second point that I think is important that we have to understand about this whole thing is what I call the construction stage of revolutionary agenda. Every revolutionary endeavor must aim firstly to destroy the infrastructures of oppression in Africa, such as the military base, the foreign military troops, and the French military presence on the continent. All these are the infrastructures of colonialism or of oppression that must be destroyed. And the second mission of revolutionary agenda must then build the infrastructures of prosperity, of security, and of peace in Africa. So, in other words, it means that as the military presence of France in Africa is actually kicked out, we should then see a kind of project to construct or to build another system or another infrastructure that will then guarantee the protection, the real protection of African people, the defense of African people, and the prosperity of African people, because these foreign military bases were presumably on the continent for that purpose, even though we know they were there just to guarantee the exploitation of the continent. So the question that we need to ask is, has this second stage been implemented in Senegal? And if it has to be implemented, right, what is the format under which they are being implemented? Because if Senegal kicks out France or French troops from Senegal in order to think that it can build Senegalese army in order to protect the Senegalese population and Senegal as a country, and I think that is another strategic mistake. And the reason why it is a strategic mistake is simple, because when you compare data between Senegal and France, you see that Senegal has got like 70 years to catch up with the France, in a way that the military spending of Senegal is about 500 million US dollars, while the military spending of France is about 55 billion US dollars, and the difference is very huge. When you talk about the GDP of France, you see that France GDP is about 3 trillion US dollars, while Senegal GDP is about 30 billion US dollars. It's like 10 times, 100 times rather. There's a huge gap between Senegal and France. So it will take a lot of years for Senegal to be able to reach out to France. When you look at the military personnel, France has got about 200 military personnel, right, ready to fight, while Senegal has got about 1,800, something like that. So there's no way that Senegalese will be able to build their military and defense capability to be able to equal French imperial force or French military force. The only way then, I think, as I spoke about the format under which the Senegalese capability can be built, the only way is to do it through Pan-Africanism framework. And when I talk about Pan-Africanism framework, I look at it in a way that instead of building Senegalese armies, we look at a situation where Senegal eventually join the Sahel countries, which is Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, so that we can see a growing, consolidated military capability in Africa, and precisely in West Africa, because individually these countries, no matter how much they can try to build their military capabilities, they won't be able to resist French invasion, they can't resist American invasion, they can't resist British invasion, so forth and so on. But if we are able to come to that point where we build, instead of building Senegalese army, then we build a continental army, African army. We build African defense system. We build African budget for defense. We build African budget for education in all areas of activities. If we are able to come up with these Pan-Africanist strategies, we'll be able to guarantee that we have a better future as we are moving forward. Otherwise, we will be always turning around the same point where French can one day decide to move into our countries without resistance and crush any kind of projects that we have or any kind of initiative that we have undertaken to liberate ourselves. Well, I think in conclusion, I would say that the only way that African people can free themselves, can liberate themselves is through Pan-Africanism. Without Pan-Africanism, Africa has no chance to liberate itself. Africa will remain for the rest of this century and the centuries to come under the yoke of neocolonialism, or maybe that's maybe this time around a Chinese neocolonialism. I hope this message found you in a good space, in a good spirit, and it was indeed important to you. If it is, I would invite you to like the video and share it and subscribe to our channel. Peace and love, freedom and decolonization to all African people, those at home, those abroad, and those in the future. Thank you. See you next time. Bye-bye.